The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting, and Staffing Services contract. I'm Chris Pitcher from ICF. I'll be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our racial equity training series and is entitled Anti-Racism in Practice. It is my privilege to introduce our first presenter today, and that is Donald Whitehead. Donald.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Chris, for leading us in the introduction of today's session, and thank you for your leadership throughout. I'm Donald Whitehead. I'm one of the co-founders of Racial Equity Partners. Racial Equity Partners is a group of trainers that work really hard to bring forth some of the tools necessary to reach racially centered organizations, to help organizations transform to become equitable in the homeless space. Our organization was founded almost 3 years ago, and we were founded by Jeff Olivet, who is the current executive director of the Interagency Council on Homelessness, and myself. We've since grown throughout the last 3 years, basically because people are really interested in understanding and equipping themselves for this work. So we've been with you for a while, and Sarah Breyer, who is my co-presenter today, will introduce herself as well. I personally have been working in this space, the homeless space, for over 25 years. I've been working on racial equity work for the same time. Also wear another hat. I'm also the executive director of the National Coalition for the Homeless. So we thank you for joining us today, and really are very appreciative of those who have been with us throughout this journey. We started with a historical analysis of the issue of race and equity in the United States, and we journeyed forward to talk about things like implicit bias and microaggressions and internalized racism, and also racial healing. This series is a building block of tools and information that will be useful as you navigate this world that we're trying to achieve. That is a world where there is equality at its center. And we thank you for joining us. We hope that you will always have an open mind. Today, though, we'll discuss how to create anti-racist workspaces. We'll learn some ways that white advantage and white privilege is reinforced through our workplace culture and actions, and take charge of those cultural norms. And we'll develop an understanding of those things. We'll learn to identify cultural patterns and identify anecdotes that can level the playing field. We'll ask questions like, why does culture matter? And how does the workplace culture reinforce white advantage? And finally, we hope to end the day with what you can do about it. So these series of workshops build on our tool set, and they address the 3 levels of racism that we identify. And those start with systemic racism, of course, and that's a system that intentionally provides advantages to one group over another. Usually the group is the group of people that identify themselves as white over people that identify themselves as people of color. And we have looked at how systemic racism has developed over time and been intentionally incorporated into our culture, our history, and our institutions. And then we go to institutional racism, and that is those organizations through practice and procedure actually perpetuate that system of dominance by one culture over another. And finally, we'll talk about individual racism, and we'll talk about that more later. Today, we want to focus on institutions, how racism is perpetuated and promoted within a workspace, sometimes without knowledge of it. And so we will continue today to look at that. But as always, we'll ask that as we go through today's training, And all of the trainings, in fact, that we'll do forward, we always want to point out that it's really, really important that we follow these guidelines that were developed by by Singleton on race. These are courageous conversations that actually developed in the education space, but we believe are very important to follow and utilize as we do a deep dive into conversations about race and racism. And so one of the things that is first in Glenn Singleton's conversations about race is that when you have these conversations, they're not the conversations that we normally have in the workplace. And for that reason, and for the reasons that some of the historical analysis bring, please expect to experience some discomfort as we go through this. These are not easy conversations to have, especially in a public space. So expect to experience some discomfort. But in spite of that discomfort, we're asking that you stay engaged, that as we go through the conversations that may be discomforting, that you stay engaged, that you don't allow whatever else is going on. And we know a lot is going on right now, especially working in the field of homelessness. But today we ask you to stay engaged in this conversation because it has tremendous benefits moving forward. We ask that in our conversations, whether they be large group or small conversations, that you speak your truth, that as you engage in conversation, that conversation comes from your own experience, that you do not represent any race of people or any organization, that it's your truth, that you're speaking from your personal experience and you're bringing that to the table so that we all can learn from that. Also, we'll be doing this series for a few more weeks. We've been doing this work for a few years, and racism has existed in this country since its beginning. So we will not find closure today on this issue or the issue of racism overall. So expect to have non-closure on this issue, but we hope we'll whet your appetite to look for more information about any of these topics that we'll go over. And lastly, please suspend judgment. We're hoping that whatever is exposed during these conversations, whoever speaks, that we allow them the freedom to speak openly about topics that we know, again, are a bit uncomfortable. So we thank you for being here today. We really appreciate your attendance, and we hope that you leave today with a new understanding of how to affect in your workplace an anti-racist culture and anti-racist organization. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Sarah Breyer, who is my co-presenter and also one of the associates for Racial Equity Partners.
Thanks, Donald. And so again, I'm Sarah Breyer, and I'm a Racial Equity Partners Associate. I run at my own consulting practice that centers race equity in the context of policy development and organizational development. And I come to the work with about 30 plus years of work in the criminal legal system and youth justice systems transformation. So today we are going to talk about culture. So if we're going to try to change our cultural norms, we have to understand what culture is first, before we can understand how we can change it. So we're going to start with a discussion around the iceberg, which probably many of you have seen before. We tend to think of culture as art or language or fashion. And of course, while this is a part of culture, what we're going to talk about today are those invisible patterns of behavior that govern how we act, what we believe in, what just seems natural. At the end of the day, culture is patterns. It's patterns of behavior. We do it day in, day out without thinking about it. The other thing to note about culture is that it's dynamic. It's not fixed. We change culture by changing our patterns of behavior. So here you can see sort of in broad strokes, you've got those things we talked about at the tip of the iceberg, the things that we can see, that we can point to around culture. And then all the things that we just take for granted, a relationship to time, how we communicate with each other, a relationship to power, how we think about things. All these things are hidden and we just don't even think about it. So here's a sort of a finer way of looking at the iceberg. So you may think that you're constantly making personal choices in all of these issues, and you are making personal choices. But if you break the cultural norms, you and others around you are generally aware of how you've broken those norms. The thing about culture is that culture is learned. We're not born with the culture. It's not innate. We grow up in a culture. We have to learn its rules. We learn it in every single interaction. So if culture is learned, culture can be unlearned, culture can be changed. So here's again, some of the things that, again, at the top, the things that we normally think of as culture. And then if we look at the bottom, we have things around like patterns of behavior between bosses and people who work for them. Concepts of justice, incentives, what gets incentivized us to work, how we make decisions individually or in groups, our tempo of work, whether we work all day long, do we take long breaks in the middle, what's expected of us. We're going to dig into a lot of these because this is where advantage and our patterns of advantage and disadvantage get reinforced in our workplace. So in this country, white culture is the dominant culture, but of course we also have myriad subcultures. Because white culture is the dominant culture, we all have to know and generally abide by the norms and rules in order to succeed within the culture. For those of us who are white, it's pretty much invisible to us. It doesn't require any adaptation on our part. You'll often hear white people say, I don't have a culture, but they do, they just can't see it. We just can't see it, it's invisible to us. For those of us who grew up in different subcultures, or even in other countries in entirely different cultures, you have to adapt and learn the white culture. You have to sort of code switch and learn those dominant culture rules in order to survive. So many of us become really adept at this code switching, but for white people, we usually don't have to code switch at all. It's just our culture. We get to be advantaged by it, and we get to live in it. So culture is often called, the relationship to culture is often called, is compared to fish who don't see the water that they swim in, right? It's just like the air you breathe, you don't see it, it's just your environment. But in our case, the waters that we're swimming in are really toxic, right? And so we're gonna unpack a little bit around what are the poisons, what are the toxicities in this water, and what are the antidotes. So in order to do that, we have to talk a little bit about white supremacy culture, and not just white culture, because white culture really is white supremacy culture. So we're going to dig in a little bit first into what is white supremacy. So here's a definition of white supremacy by Layla Saad, who wrote a great book called Me and White Supremacy, and did I think a 28-day Undoing White Supremacy challenge, which I recommend that you check out. So of course, so she wrote the belief that the white race is inherently superior to other races, and that white people should have control over people of other races. The social, economic, and political systems that collectively enable white people to maintain power over people of other races. So white supremacy, as we've talked about in other trainings, is not just about the KKK or the Proud Boys. It's a belief system that permeates our society. Whiteness itself was created as a way to center power and privilege in white people and people who were not enslaved. It became a shorthand way of defining a caste system in which people who are white got all the goodies and everybody else didn't. And in previous trainings, we talked about how over our country's history, we have grappled with who gets to be white. And we can see over our history how different groups have been allowed to move from being quote unquote colored, such as the Irish and Italian immigrants, to being white. So whiteness is about power. And I'm going to keep saying that, we cannot stress it enough. It's really about how power is distributed in our society. And we're going to talk about how it gets distributed at our workplace too. Tema Okun wrote a lot about white supremacy workplace culture. She was the first one to put forward these ideas about how a workplace can reinforce white advantage. It's really important to know that white supremacy culture harms everybody, but the impact is different based on your race, class, gender, sexuality, lived experiences, all, etc. But again, in the workplace, it's all about how it reinforces existing power structures. So what Tema Okun wrote was that white supremacy culture is the widespread ideology baked into the beliefs, values, norms, and standards of our groups, our communities, our towns, our states, our nation, teaching us both overtly and covertly that whiteness holds value, whiteness is value. Teaches us that Blackness is not only valueless, but also dangerous and threatening. It pits other races and racial groups against each other, while always defining them as inferior to the white group. So we're talking about white supremacy culture in the workplace. We're talking about how our workplace culture advantages some people over other people. So I'm going to say something about white supremacy workplace culture. There's been a lot written about white supremacy culture, and still I know this term can be uncomfortable for people or can trigger people and make them resistant to listening and learning. Many people resent the association with white supremacy with orientations to work that feel productive, that feel normal, that feel appropriate. So another way to think about this, and I've referenced this before, is how does our workplace culture reinforce existing power structures? Of course, people in power tend to be white people, but it doesn't necessarily have to be white people who are reinforcing disadvantageous power structures. So even if it's not white people at the top, the cultural traits that we're going to talk about can keep people without power from ever attaining power, advantage, or privilege. They can keep people divided. They can keep us from showing up as our whole selves at our workplace, and they can get in the way of creating an inclusive work environment. So again, white privilege is embedded in everyday interactions at work. It's the assumptions we make about what is professional. It's the ways we make decisions, hold our meetings, etc. It probably all feels normal. It's just the way it's done. It's how all offices operate. It's how we think we achieve excellence. It's how we produce high quantities of work, but not necessarily high quality work. So if we're going to undo them, we're going to have to unpack this little suitcase of these cultural patterns. So just key points to go over before we start digging in, unpacking that suitcase. Culture is invisible, but it's powerful. It's everywhere. Culture's everywhere. White supremacy culture reinforces white advantage. It pits people against each other, people without advantage. And our workplace cultures perpetuate existing societal power structures. So, and I'm going to reiterate one more thing about culture, because this feels it feels maybe a little bit miserable, but culture is learned, culture can be unlearned. Culture is patterns of behavior. We can create new patterns of behavior. And that's what we're here to learn about and do today. So with that, I'm going to toss it back to Donald to help us start unpacking it.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for a really good overview. We're going to next go into 5 places where power lurks in the workplace. And we talk about these 5 places, and we will encounter these over and over again in the workspace. And that power dynamic shows up constantly. And there's some very good reading on this if people have not had the opportunity to do it, to read it. There is a Peggy McIntosh has a really good book. It's called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And it talks about places where you don't really think about it, but you really do have an advantage over other people as you navigate through the world. But these are 5 ways that the supremacy culture shows up at work. Approaches to conflict and conflict avoidance. Who has the right to engage in conflict and has the comfort around conflict? And it's also calling in and calling out when there is something that happens in the workplace that is an issue that may cause some discomfort. Who has the ability to call in and call out? And we'll talk a little bit more about calling in and calling out and some examples of that. So many times people avoid that conflict. They avoid talking about the feeling of uncomfortability because they don't feel like they're a part of the power structure. And that is the second way. In decision making, there's often in a white supremacy culture, in a white dominant culture, there's also always power hoarding and the inability to be able to be a part of the decision-making process in your workspace. You'll often see, and we find this when we do assessments on organizations, especially some of our nonprofit and homeless organizations, that we'll see a dynamic where there is very little diversity in the C-suite. So those who are really making the decisions about what happens within an organization when it comes to policy and procedure, when it comes to funding, when it comes to operation, a lot of that power is all white or very white, or there's very little diversity within those groups. And so the power of that organization, although the work might be very diverse at the ground level, so there's a lot of people on the ground level who are a part of the decision-making process on the ground level. When it comes to the more consequential decisions, those are always, made by people who are not diverse in their overall makeup. So that power hoarding is another dynamic of that culture where power lurks in the workplace and is always kind of hoarded by those at the top, who tend to be people that are white. And then there are also, in that same dynamic, it also creates a lack of transparency around process for making decisions and outcomes. That happens quite often. And so there is often that issue where the decision-making, people never get to see the process of making those decisions if they aren't in that power structure. And sometimes there are organizations that do have diversity, but we see very, very often when we look at the dynamics of power and power hoarding in an organization where that power lies. There's also meetings that have meetings, for instance, are often run with Robert's Rules of Order. And sometimes, and that's just one example of how power hoarding actually comes into this dynamic as well. Sometimes people aren't oriented to that kind of decision-making process and feel ill-equipped to be able to operate in that. That's one example. What time meetings are held. This is especially important when we talk about people with lived experience or people who are at the bottom of the economic ladder, who may have challenges with transportation, where the meeting's located at, or daycare. Those are other things that come up that really have an impact and demonstrate that culture and lack of power sharing. The lack of feedback. Only those that are at the top of the ladder are many times involved in feedback. There isn't really a opportunity for feedback to, one, be given, or feedback to be actually entertained by those at the top. And finally, dynamics in power struggles within the workplace are overworking, expecting that people will overwork, and expecting perfectionism, and also catastrophizing things at times. Things become urgent that are not as important because the culture dictates perfectionism. And because of that, people, one, again, are overworked, and also people are put into a place of urgency when urgency really isn't the order of the day. And we find that quite often. So conflict, I talked a little bit about conflict avoidance. So in the culture, conflict is really usually frowned on. There's even many times people are characterized by their willingness or unwillingness to be involved in conflict. We often hear about the angry Black woman. And many times that's people expressing their feelings of conflict, and the culture isn't open at times for that, and people run into many problems in that. So these characteristics, they focus on the cultural assumption that one's informal and informal power have the right to confront, which means we cannot tolerate conflict, particularly open conflict. So there's an avoidance of these uncomfortable conversations, and that's why this is so new. Because for most of the time, our culture is not open to having these kind of dialogues, and you see that in the pushback on critical race theory. But it happens in our workforce in a lot of different ways. That's just one example of people not wanting to get into conversations that are very valuable, but do bring up some discomfort. The assumption supports the tendency to blame the person or group for causing discomfort or conflict rather than addressing the issues being named. And many times you'll see detours when conversations that are really discomforting conversations, but really have a lot of real issues underlying them. Detours are often presented, and there's a lot of written material about detour spotting, and it shows up in a lot of different ways. People will, when discussions with race come up, sometimes there's detours to talk about other populations. There's even times when people will start to embrace a victimization conversation. So we know, and as we talk about this, it's important that you understand that that racism isn't just individual acts of meanness, that systems that perpetuate dominance of one group over another are not necessarily individual meanness. They're just a culture that's been created that disadvantages people. So we're not calling people racist, and we know that people have gone through many struggles in their lives. But one of the things you'll find is that the struggles don't involve the color of your skin. There may be things that keep you from progressing, but the color of your skin, unless you're a person of color, is not one of those things. So this means that the needs and opinions of people not in power don't get addressed or listened to often because that detour comes in. White people feeling uncomfortable, generally around people of color, and fearful of saying something that they might not mean to say or may engender strong emotions. Those are ways to avoid the conflict. Strong emotions are discouraged, and when exhibited are seen as signs of lack of professionalism. So again, the angry Black woman syndrome, and I just use that as an example of sometimes people expressing really deep-rooted fears and trauma and experiences that are uncomfortable, and those experiences being written off as lack of professionalism. We see that quite often. We also see that staff who is most impacted or oppressed are isolated from each other during organizational conflicts. Again, the idea of separating people from them. So individual meetings happen instead of collective meetings where an organization can really get to the root of problems. We see this as a tactic used very often in cultures that are dominated by supremacy. Politeness is often valued over honesty. So someone raising an issue is sometimes not listened to because they didn't do it in a way that's most polite or most effective. Again, we find this a lot when there are people who may not have been part of professional networks, and that's people with lived experience, or people who are in jobs that are service sector jobs. And sometimes really, really valuable insight is overlooked because of the way they express it. And so it's a very easy way of discounting one's contribution to the workplace, to the workforce, using a detour of politeness as a way to discount people. So that happens very often. And one remedy for these kinds of situations are calling people in or calling people out. And so one of the things that we can do when we're in situations where one, either we're made to feel uncomfortable by the actions of a colleague, or we see a situation where somebody else is in that, is we can call people in, or we can call people out. Calling people in is a more individualized, personal kind of call in to people. You could say something like, "Is that really what you meant?" And that opens up a dialogue, and it doesn't necessarily make people defensive. And other questions are, "I'm curious, and what was your intention when you said that?" And another one is, "Why do you think that that's the case? Why do you believe that that is true?" And these probing questions really start a dialogue. And these are kind of a softer way of addressing in the workplace. Again, when you see people being called, people being made uncomfortable by statements or microaggressions, these are ways to do that. And how did you decide or determine or conclude this? And what is the connection between this and that? So those are very easy ways of calling people in. And really, that's a way to really start a dialogue that makes that issue, instead of a confrontation, it makes it a conversation where people have the ability to help you understand, and sometimes it helps them understand a microaggression or something that is offensive to another person that they may not have deemed to be offensive. One that always sticks out to me is "where are you from?" For some people, it's just a common phrase. And at times you've known a person a long time, and that creates a little bit more of an intentional sort of investigation of this person. But at other times it is very off-putting to people, because they may have been from 2 streets over, but because they look or talk a certain way, people are asking that question, and it does become offensive at times. And so that's a place where you might not on the surface see being called in, but it's a way to be able to do that. But there's also calling out, and calling out is a little bit more of kind of a little bit more aggressive. It's when you're in a meeting and someone says something that makes you feel uncomfortable, really calling that person out and asking them, why they said that particular thing. Why did you say that? Why did you make that statement that is an obviously a racially motivated statement? Why did you say that? I had an example of my wife in a company in Orlando, Florida, where one of the people at that company actually asked my wife. My wife was explaining benefits, and the person said, "Those are great benefits. That leaves you a lot of money to get gold teeth." And so she called that person out. And that person actually really thought this was something that was funny, but it was a perfect example to me of when a person should be called out. When something is that blatant, it's really important that we let everybody in the room know that that's not funny. But the downside of calling someone out is it actually creates a defensive posture. And people can we talked about discomfort. People really get uncomfortable when they're called out. In my opinion, and this is just Donald Whitehead's opinion, calling in is a much better way to be able to get to that point. But if you are called out, we want to share a video with you. And this video kind of really, it's an overview. Francesca Ramsey, we use a lot in our training, and she will share with you what to do if you are called out, how to apologize. We do need to fix the sound.
video is recently we've had a lot of celebrities in the media screwing up, getting called out, and then offering faux apologies like Russell Simmons, Paula Deen, Anthony Weiner, most recently Cheryl Underwood. I wanted to talk about what you're supposed to do when you get called out and the way to apologize so that people believe you and know you're actually committed to change. When I talk about getting called out, what exactly do I mean? It's not just getting your feelings hurt or someone pointing out that you took the last slice of pizza. Getting called out in this context of this video is when you say or do something that upholds the oppression of a marginalized group of people. So for example, sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, something that you've said or done that basically is just perpetuating negative stereotypes or ideals that have real consequences. So in my social responsibility video, we talked about why making jokes about really serious issues or minimizing serious issues has negative consequences, but now I want to talk about what happens when that's brought to your attention and how you can successfully apologize and become an ally and now be committed to changing your behavior and doing the right thing. Usually when you call out someone's behavior or something that they've said, the natural reaction is to get defensive. You're so sensitive. I was just joking. My best friend's black. My sister's a lesbian. You are so emotional. You know I didn't mean it that way. Everybody has to be so PC nowadays. Now I can completely understand why people usually react this way. It's because no one wants to be the bad guy. And if you get called out on doing something that's oppressing another group of people, well, that's bad and no one wants to be bad. But I want to discourage you from going that route because what you really need to do is listen, because this is where the other person is hopefully going to explain to you what you did wrong and how you can change it. Another thing that people tend to fall back on in these instances is their intent. Oh, I didn't mean it like that, or you're interpreting it the wrong way. In these instances, I know that you might think that that makes a difference, but we're not really worrying about your intent here because of course you didn't mean to offend anyone. There really aren't that many people that walk around trying to offend people. I mean, there are those people and they're jerks, and why would you want to be friends with those types of people? Your intent really doesn't matter because it's a matter of intent versus impact. And that's actually something I learned from a really good friend of mine, Jukebox Jones on Facebook. It doesn't matter in these instances what you meant. What matters is what's the outcome of what you said or what you did. I use the example of stepping on somebody's foot. I might step on your foot and break your toe. I didn't mean to break your toe, but your toe is still broken and it still really hurts. So instead of talking about what you meant to do, talk about what you actually did. Which brings me to the next part of this video, good apologies versus bad apologies. Now the first most common bad non-apology that I hear, I'm sorry that you were offended. That is like the worst non-apology ever, because instead of taking responsibility for your actions, you're putting the blame on the other person and saying that it's your fault that you're offended, not that you did something that offended them. So don't make that mistake. Another one that I hear a lot of times is, I'm sorry if you were offended. That one doesn't cut it either because the person is offended. So there's no reason to bring up if, and it also doesn't acknowledge what you did wrong and why it was wrong. Because you're saying if you were offended, I'm sorry, but if you weren't offended, I'm not sorry. And again, that's not how you do this apology thing. A real genuine apology is made up of two parts. The first part is you take responsibility for what you've done, and then the second part is you make a commitment to change the behavior. It's that simple, and trust me, as someone that's apologized more than a few times, as someone that's been called out more than a few times, it's not really that hard to do. The best way that I can figure out to drive this point home is to give you an example using myself. So about 2 years ago, I made this video called Queen for a Day, where I dressed up as a drag queen, went around New York City and asked people to guess if I was a man or a woman. I thought the video was hysterical. My friends thought it was really funny. It did really well on YouTube. And it wasn't until about a year later that someone brought to my attention that it was super offensive. They were like, hey, this is some transphobic garbage. Why would you do something like this? Now, of course, my initial reaction was to get defensive. I was like, what are you talking about? I'm not transphobic. What does that even mean? I have friends that are trans. I didn't mean it that way. It's just a joke. You're taking this too personally. I did all of the things that you're not supposed to do. So instead, I stopped and I listened. And they explained that if you're trans, having people try to figure out what your gender is like a daily battle, and it's not really fun, and it's super rude. And making a video that encourages that and kind of makes a game or something funny out of questioning someone's gender is basically encouraging people to participate in that type of behavior. And that's really, really bad, especially when you consider the fact that there are trans people who are regularly assaulted and murdered because people are trying to question and figure out how they identify. So once this was brought to my attention, I was like, you're right. I'm so sorry. Didn't need to talk about what my intent was or why I did it. Instead, I just said, wow, I'm really sorry. I'm really gonna make sure that I don't do that again. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. I ended up taking the video down, and since then I've really made an effort to be more aware of trans issues and try to be a better ally to the trans people in my life and in my online community. And it was surprisingly not that hard or life-changing to admit that I did something wrong. And it felt really good to know that I fixed the problem and that now I'm part of the solution. The first thing that you want to do is acknowledge what went wrong. And I'll use my example of the Queen for a Day video. I am sorry that I perpetuated transphobic behaviors by making a video that trivializes gender identity. It's a little involved. Might not need to go that in depth, but you get the point. Also, when you acknowledge what went wrong, you want to try and make sure to avoid the words but or if, because that puts conditions on your apology or why you did it. And again, we really aren't trying to talk about intent here. Something that I try to do, and I would love to impart on you guys when it comes to sincere apologies, is to say thank you. Just a super simple, thank you so much for bringing this to my attention, because it takes a lot of courage to call somebody out. It's scary and not fun, and it's a great way to like soften the experience a little bit. The last thing to remember when you're making this apology is don't just say it, do it. Remember that actions speak louder than words, and you can say sorry till the cows come home, but if you keep engaging in that sort of behavior or saying those sort of things, then your apology just doesn't really mean anything. Now that you guys know about getting called out and how to apologize, I want to hear about a time that you had to apologize. It can be something big or small. Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget, I'm posting new videos every Friday, so make sure to subscribe.
Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the video. I think, Francesca does a really, really good job of kind of bringing things down to a really an understandable level and not digging too deeply into all of the definitions and terms and things like that. But so we're going to go into small groups. And what we're going to do is broadcast 3 scenarios so that you can practice calling in or calling out. And we're going to ask you to take turns and discuss your approach. So we're going to do that for 10 minutes, Sarah, and then we're going to come back in the large room. Does that work?
I think that sounds right. Yeah, we'll do probably each scenario. Like the first one, when you get into your groups, we'll broadcast a scenario in. They're pretty short, so you should be able to look at it and read it, and then organize yourselves however you want, so you can try to practice calling in or calling out, talking about the approach that you took, as Donald said. And then after about 5 minutes, we'll do the second one, and I think we'll come back and do a quick debrief. So we'll go, if Kristen, if you can help break us up into breakout rooms, that would be awesome. I guess I stopped sharing. I was able to be in a few groups, and there was some really good discussions that I heard around the importance of calling in, calling out, but also the complexities of the actual dynamics of what it looks like when you're dealing with your coworkers. I wonder if anybody wants to share a learning or sort of a aha moment, or anything they want to share from that particular that breakout exercise.
You have Dolores with her hand up.
Sorry, I'm having trouble. Dolores, thank you.
I think for me, the calling in and calling out is also rooted in our own personal culture. Using myself as an example, I probably would tend to lean towards calling out versus calling in, because that's who I am and that's part of me and part of my cultural upbringing. And so when we talk about calling in and calling out, it really is also, I believe, very individual for the person, how comfortable you are with that and what your belief system is regarding doing either one of those.
I think thank you, Dolores, for sharing that. You're right. It's so individual, and there is a lot that's culturally embedded in what we feel more comfortable with, whether it's calling in or calling out. And I'll just share that I think white culture really is conflict avoidant, and I am off the scale on conflict avoidance. And so for me, the calling in is easier to do than the calling out. But I recognize that is how white supremacy also shows up in me and how I interact with the world. I see that Dawn has her hand up and some other folks too. Dawn, do you want to share?
I just wanted to share that in our group, we only had 2 people that were speaking, but we tried to work through the scenarios together. And my tendency would want to use the call in most of the time. But as we tried to walk through that scenario, the first thing that comes to mind or is easiest is the call out. And even when you think you're making a call in statement, it often comes out as a call out statement. Just nicely put.
Very good example. We have Shabana, Sarah, who has her hand up.
Hi, I was in the same group as Dolores, and one of the things that I said was, I think that I lean towards the calling out, and sometimes it's the way and the manner in which you do things and you say things. When we don't call it to the carpet and we allow it to just pass or want it to pass through, that gives that person the opportunity to continue to behave and say things in that way. And so I am really, really one who is about, just saying something to the person. And again, it's the way and the manner in which you say it to them.
We have Miriam as well, Sarah.
Yeah. I was going to say I just want to reiterate what Shavana said. That's so important in terms of undoing these cultural patterns, that these are patterns of behavior. And unless however we do it, calling in, calling out, whatever we do, we have to interrupt it. And whatever way feels most comfortable is the right way to do it for you. Miriam.
Just that Shavana has a wonderful point, and that interrupting the moment is important. And I think that I also lean hard to the conflict avoidant, and I think it's worth noticing that that's breaking up a little bit along racial lines, that there's something very white supremacist about keeping the conflict tucked out of sight. And that, whatever I might gently suggest to them, doing it quietly in private so that no one needs to outwardly acknowledge that there was any problem here, is an impulse that's braided in with a white supremacist culture.
100%. Thank you for elevating that. That's exactly right. And the calling out, the advantage of the calling out in public is that it helps the person who's been transgressed against know that that person has backup, that people recognize that there was a microaggression or a macroaggression, and that it's not okay. If you do it in private, it's good, you're shifting things, but in public, you're also, you're addressing that power issue in the moment and making a public statement that the person who's being transgressed against sees and can change that culture. Any other comments? If not, I think we're ready for a break, right, Chris?
We are. So thank you so much for hanging with us. We are going to readjust the breakout rooms for next breakout. Take 5 minutes. So I want to see you back at 12:08. And just from a personal measure, a personal standpoint, just to kind of round out this conversation, I'm a call out kind of person, but that doesn't make you popular necessarily. It does make a splash, I will say that. So definitely consider all the different ways we can call one another in and out. And let's call it 12:09 at this point, because I rambled on into the turn of another minute. So see you back at 12:09.
Awesome. Well, welcome back, everybody. We're entering into our second half of our workshop here, and we're going to talk about several other ways that white supremacy or power structures are reinforced. So we did the quick overview in the beginning, and so one of them is around decision making. And I love talking about decision making because this is where you often hear people feel the most disempowered. So frequently in institutions, decisions are made in ways that reinforce existing inequalities. Shows up with lack of transparency about who's making the decision, what decision is being made, how it's being made, and it's really only clear to people who are already in power. It shows up in ways that people in power think that they're capable of making decisions for and in the interest of people without power. It shows up through information hoarding, shows up through lack of inclusion for people who will either be affected by the decision or people who have to implement the decision. It shows up in the belief that there's really only one right way, the sort of either or binary thinking. So there's no sort of flexibility around thinking outside the box, around trying to expand your options. There's no culture of learning. There's no room for mistakes. So if a decision goes wrong, there's blame. Blame gets passed around, and there's anger, and there's no way to learn from decisions and the outcomes of those decisions. And finally, decisions are pushed to be made quickly. Donald talked about this as well. So this is often in the guise of being more productive. We got to get this done. There's so much to do. We just got to make this decision. Sort of this false sense of urgency, which we're going to dig into again. There's a lot about urgency in white supremacy culture. Not surprisingly, given the genesis of our country and how it's built on slave labor. So again, no time to consider alternatives. There's no time to include people in the process. So decision making, and you will often hear if you organization and you ask what people are feel upset about, it's decisions that are made that impact their everyday work life that they had no say in. They weren't included, they weren't asked about it. These decisions just sort of come on down from the top, and then they just have to implement them and they have to deal with the ramifications. So what are the fixes? So this is a whole workshop in itself, but I'm going to just run through a few of the fixes and give you some resources if you want to dig in deeper. So I really like this, what's called the rapid decision-making process from Bridgespan Consulting Group. It's a really good process to embrace, particularly around important and really impactful decisions, and it gives you a rubric for how to think about big decisions, for the elements that need to be included, and the effort to be transparent. So RAPID stands for R, so who's recommending? This is the person who's corralling the decision, who's organizing the decision process, that's the recommender. There's the A for agree, who must agree to this decision, who's critical to say, yes, I agree. Maybe it's, you're making some decision around human resources and you have to have both the director of human resources and the director of finance has to be in agreement with that decision. P, who is going to perform that decision, who is going to implement it. They need to be part of the process of deciding, of informing that decision. They can't be left out until the very end. They have critical information about whether that decision is going to work or not in the organization, but they also, they're going to know whether it's going to work or not, but they also, their viewpoint is really critical. If they're not involved, they're probably not going to implement it well. I is just generally who needs to provide input. It could be a variety of people, and we're going to talk a little bit more about input. And then D, who's the decider? Who's actually, is it one person, is it two people? To be clear about who's actually making the decision. So it just gives you a really nice, clear way of thinking about all the stakeholders who need to be involved in a decision-making process. There's some other key points about process. So one is about transparency. Really important to be transparent from the beginning, throughout the process, and at the very end about what decision is being made, who's asked to inform the process, who's giving input, who's guiding the process, who's actually making the decision. Just be really clear at the very beginning. You can do a staff email in the middle. How's it going? And at the very end, you have a rubric for how to describe how that decision was made and who informed the process. And then it helps everyone just get clarity. It's not a mystery. It's not an unknown. When we're talking about giving input, and we look at that rapid process, there's that I for input, who's giving input. One of the things you want to think about in terms of those stakeholders is who is going to be affected by the decision, who can best inform, who's going to be implementing, we talked about, but who's historically been left out of this kind of decision? Who brings different perspectives to the table, right? Who is going to be impacted by the decision? Is it going to be people in the community? Do they need to be at the table? How are we going to get them at the table? Two more things about decisions. Either or thinking. You want to expand your options. Either or thinking is classic, sort of white supremacy, limited. It's one way or the other, sorry. The Management Center has some really great racial equity oriented tools. They have a great decision mitigation tool. I highly recommend it. Super simple. You've got some decisions, you've got some options. List out 2 or 3 pros and cons for each option. And for each con that you have, brainstorm some mitigations for that option. Brainstorm some mitigations for that con. What are some ways to fix it? I don't have time to dig into this. It's no whole other workshop, but it really helps open up the field for, maybe we can come to a better decision here. And finally, urgency. We keep talking about urgency because it is a hallmark of our workplace culture, and it is unhelpful for racial equity. So it's really important to know that while some decisions really are urgent, there's no question, we're not saying that that's not true. Some decisions are urgent, but really be careful of false urgency. So false urgency will sacrifice the process, it will sacrifice inclusion for the sake of a quick decision. The quick decision is going to serve the power structure. It's not going to serve racial equity. It's not going to serve inclusion. So be thoughtful about whether it's a real urgency or false urgency. And just know that sometimes when you rush a decision, it might take more time in the long run because people who didn't get their chance to voice their thoughts and feelings will maybe at best resent, but maybe at worst even undermine the decision that gets made. So process matters. All right, we have a lot to cover here, so I'm going to keep on rolling, and I'm sorry I talk fast, but it's how I do it. Meetings, issues, and remedies. So meetings, we spend a lot of our time in meetings, whether in real life or virtually, and it's really important to develop good meeting awareness. Power lurks in meetings for sure. It may feel like neutral ground, but there's lots of ways that power plays out. So what's good meeting awareness? You want to think about who's responsible for the meeting housework, who's setting up the meeting, who's cleaning up, who's taking notes, who's buying snacks, who's making coffee, who's running the PowerPoint, who's organizing, who's putting people, who's running the breakout rooms. Just to be clear, have some meeting awareness around those logistics, right? And think about equity. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to ensure equity in that. You want to think about the time and place that meetings are held. You obviously want to stick to working hours. Don't meet during school pickup times, for instance. Think about who gets floor time at meetings. Is it actually representative of who's in attendance? Think about who gets interrupted. Is there a demographic pattern in who gets interrupted and who is interrupting? Think about who's invited. Are the right people invited? And think about where people are sitting. Less an issue in a Zoom meeting, but in real life, some people may be sitting at the table, other people may be sitting around the periphery. Quick fixes, right? So meeting logistics. Instead of asking for volunteers for the housework, just rotate them evenly, rotate those houseworking tasks evenly across the staff who are in the meeting. Really, when we're talking about interruptions, actually, before interruptions, I want to talk about stolen ideas. This happens all the time. So people of color, women will often make a suggestion, make a point, and no one hears it until the white person says it, right? The white man, but often just the white person. So you can just call this out just by and letting folks know, like, hey, someone already made that point. But you know what to do, you can just say like, hey, I agree with Donald on that point. He raised that, was really important. I agree with Rashima. Just call it out and say, hey, I saw that someone else made that point first, and let's acknowledge that. Let's give them credit for that. If people are interrupters, don't give them free rein. Don't let them interrupt. You can just say, hey, please let her finish her point. You can enforce a no interruptions policy, have people raise their hand in a virtual meeting. One thing about meetings is that if you want everyone to be respected and to be acknowledged, so it's something there's something about leading the meeting, and part of leading the meeting is acknowledging that everyone's there for a reason. Everyone has a role. So you can, I think it's easier to have an inclusive conversation if, and people are more likely to hear everyone's ideas if you're really clear about the role. So you say, well, I'm really glad that Donald is in the room here with us because he brings decades of experience doing this work. And I know that his input is going to be really important for us to move this process forward. So you can do that for each person. So everyone knows, oh, that's why this person's here. They're going to be, it gives what they say more gravitas. I think I'm going to stop on meetings, and I'm going to switch it over to Donald for the next piece.
Thank you, Sarah, for that transition and really good overview. We've talked about some of this already, so I'm going to go through it really quickly. Just some of the things that we talked about in terms of workplace culture. We talked about that culture of perfectionism, right? Where there isn't an opportunity for people to be human or make mistakes. So there's all relatively there's always these written or unwritten norms that have to be followed, and when you go outside of those, it becomes conflict. But the power in oriented cultures often call for perfectionism. That happens all the time. There's, again, no regular channel for feedback. So we know that we learn from feedback, that there's ways of looking at places where we miss things, blind spots come through feedback often, but in many dominated cultures, there is no room for that. So it becomes, improvement becomes stagnant in those places. And if there is feedback, it's blame and shame. It's kind of what you didn't do perfectly. It's a way to take the responsibility away from the leader and put it on the people that they're leading instead of being constructive. So there isn't that opportunity to take away from what didn't go well in a situation and go back to what did go well. So it's that blame and shame when something doesn't happen perfectly. This is another characteristic of those dominant culture organizations. We talked about the false sense of urgency. It happens a lot in the nonprofit world when we talk about the issues. We know that with homelessness, people are dying. People are experiencing all kinds of really traumatic experiences because of the work. It is urgent. But we overlook sometimes real inclusion because we want to get right to quick fixes on our some of the solutions that we need to kind of get to for the resolution of some of the problems we address in social service. It can cause us to be more transactional in our efforts and less transformational. So we go for the immediate fix rather than the structural change. And that happens quite often when we're doing work around racial injustice, and we ignore the structural issues and we go to very myopic solutions. That is another norm in a dominant culture. So those are some things that we often need to talk about. People in power flex their muscles often. They have these declarations that kind of underscore their position versus your position. That happens quite often in some of the dominant culture organizations. And again, overworking in this case is a close cousin to false urgency, asking people to go beyond what is required of them to do and whatever the contractual relationship is with your work. Just there's a clear expectation that because you're doing this work, because it's so important, it is important, but it requires you to not pay attention to your family and your other networks and kind of there's an expectation that you overwork. And so those are some of the characteristics, and I'm not going to stay there long because I want to honor the time for discussion. And so what I want to do, as opposed to continuing down this course, is to just talk about, we have another video. And this video is on the culture of overwork. Please take a listen to Robin Ely. And we're going to look at the culture of overwork as one of those symptoms of a dominant environment in the workplace.
The culture of overwork creates a situation where people daily have to choose.
We do need to turn up the sounds a little bit.
Got to choose between work and personal life. For many people, that's work and family. Because we think of that as a problem of work-family conflict, the way that they address it and the way many companies do is work-family accommodations, which are great. The problem with work-family accommodations in a context, in a culture of overwork, is that people who take them are seen as uncommitted and their careers are derailed. It's like, well, oh, if I want to work here and be successful, I'm going to have to give up that part of my life. I'm going to only have work. I'm not going to have love. And so we end up with these kinds of cultures of overwork that have all sorts of negative implications, among them that it's really hard for women to advance in them. Everybody has the same explanation for why women aren't advancing. This work requires 24/7 availability. Women are not able to meet that requirement because of, when they have children, they're devoted to their children, and that's why they haven't advanced. The narrative is, it's a problem women have, not men. Men are the workers, men go to work, and women stay home with the kids. In fact, what we saw for both men and women is a real wish to be at work and to fulfill their work ambitions, and a real wish to have a personal life, whether it's with kids or community or spouses, partners. Everybody was feeling the tension of having to go to one side or the other in a context that basically says if you're going to work here and you're going to be successful, you need to be available 24/7. Women are going against the cultural grain, men are going with it, and they're both paying a price. I think the culture of overwork is a good, pithy way to describe it, because it is a culture, and it is overwork. This is, I think, particularly true in professional service firms. Very often you'll hear, well, the client, you have to be at the beck and call of the client. And so that could be, who knows where the client is in the world, or, and that's what forces the tension. I think I've studied enough professional service firms to be able to say that imperative is a myth. I'm not saying people don't need to work hard. I'm not saying that there aren't sometimes points when you might have to pull an all-nighter and, spend a weekend at the office, whatever. But this kind of constant, relentless 24/7 availability is really fabricated for other purposes. It's really serving this other function of allowing among a group of highly ambitious, competitive people to stand out as the superstar. So we heard stories of consultants saying, we put together these 100 slide decks and we've spent the entire weekend perfecting them. I mean, 100 slides, like a client does not want 100 slides. So why do we do it? We do it because it's our opportunity to prove how smart we are, how smart and analytical we are. It has nothing to do with what the client needs. It has nothing to do with maintaining the competitiveness of the firm. And in fact, there's research to suggest that that kind of overwork is actually undermining, ultimately, of a firm's competitiveness because it burns people out. There's all sorts of negative repercussions of that kind of requirement. Quite frankly, as an organizational scholar, I'm much more interested in actually what organizations can do about this. If they really are interested in addressing these issues of structural inequality, to say, where in our culture do we see structural inequality getting reproduced? And what are the narratives? What are the kinds of interactions people are having with each other? What are our policies, our norms, and really taking a look at that? Is this really true? Do we really need 24/7 availability? Is it really true that it's only women who are suffering? And do we want to change that?
So thank you again. And I hope you were able to connect the video with what we've been talking about today and how that whole culture, and it really is very prevalent within the nonprofit social service world. Especially if you work on things like grants or anything to do with the funding. But in all aspects of the work, to be honest, you're often asked to go beyond what is really the norm, and that again is as was characterized in the video. Sometimes that's someone else's idea about presenting themselves as a superstar or better than the rest, and it is actually a characteristic of a dominant culture. So we do want to go into small groups again.
I want to add
And-
one thing to that, Donald,
Sure.
if I can, that one of the things we see in nonprofits in particular, so this was an interesting video because clearly she had done her research and was talking about the for-profit world, but those same issues arise in nonprofit. And one of the things that we see in the nonprofit world is that, particularly in the social service sector, is a lot of nonprofits are led by white women, or at least historically they're led by white women. And white women come to the work with accumulated wealth. They come to the work probably with like 2 incomes in the household. They come to the work with all kinds of supports, and they bring an expectation frequently of people not having another life outside of the workplace because they have supports to handle all that other life that everybody actually has. And so I think I want to just sort of call out that there's a way that this gets particularly reinforced around with white women, because we see that a lot in the nonprofit space.
Thank you. Very, very important point to make, because it is definitely, there is a dominant culture within the nonprofit world, and it is white women in the leadership chair, and then everybody else at the front line. Every so often there is a man in charge as well, but that culture persists, whether it's a man or a woman, but certainly, and really when we're working with marginalized groups, it's something that is really, really always missed, that dynamic and where people are coming from as part of those discussions. Even in our meetings on Zoom, I mean, I think people often take for granted that not everybody has access to the internet, or not everybody has a computer, not everybody has the same way to communicate, and often that gets overlooked. So we're going to go into small groups again. Sarah, did you have another point? Okay, so our small group this time is to talk about a time when you were able to put the brakes on a culture of overworking at your organization. And what did you do? And what barriers did you have to overcome to get there? So think about your own situation at your organization. And if you were ever pushed into this culture of overworking, and were you able to interrupt that? And tell us what you did to do that. And what are the barriers that you had to overcome? So we'll do, this breakout group is going to be about 15 minutes. I think we have time for 15 minutes in this breakout group. And then
And
we'll come back in and do a short debrief.
And if folks can, I know that if folks are able to take themselves off video, I know it can make it a little bit easier to talk in the room. So.
Okay, did you guys see the breakout question?
Yes,
So
I start, sir. Mr.
anybody
Donald.
want to share?
I-
Miriam, did you want to share? Oh, you were shaking your head and I thought that was a,
Candy
okay,
does.
we have
Candy.
Candy. Candy
Okay.
Candy took you off the hook there, Miriam. Candy, you want to go ahead?
What I want to take with me is not letting things go that need to be addressed.
Yeah. Yeah, we can only interrupt patterns by interrupting them, right?
Yes,
If the pattern
yes,
continues.
yes.
That's exactly right. I see folks are putting, so Miriam did raise her hand.
I didn't want to swoop in and steal Candy's thunder because that was such a good thought. But for me, I'm taking back the idea of false urgency, and that so many times I'm communicating deadlines and following up and saying, come on now, and maybe I can cool it with that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. I love the false urgency, and it's sometimes really hard to separate out from the real urgency because, as Donald said, the work is urgent, right? People are being hurt, but we don't want to hurt people in the process of helping people.
Absolutely. I think I'm guilty of false urgency deadlines because I'm so passionate about ending homelessness that I will kind of push people. So I do this workshop has helped me think about, you know, my pushing the false sense of urgency sometimes. So I definitely want to take a look at that. Any other thoughts about that? We had some really good conversations in our last group too.
I see Lisa in the chat said practice the art of thinking before speaking to avoid being called out or called in. Yeah. Always a good thing. Oh,
Kelly has her hand up too, Sarah.
Kelly.
Actually, it's Melinda.
I'm not Kelly.
Sorry.
Very true.
Kelly is right next to me.
No, I'm Kelly.
Kelly. All right, what does Melinda have to say? No?
Melinda, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, sorry. We were both on unmute, so we were echoing. I think as a group, we are taking back like the false urgencies and talking over each other, because I know like both of us are very passionate, and when we start trying to throw our ideas together, we kind of just run over each other. I mean, we still listen to each other, but we just both talk at the same time a lot of the time. So we're going to work on that as a group, and keep on making sure that we take our breaks away from the computer just to clear our head, go for a little walk down our stairs, and just, you know, try to stay together as a team and keep that positive energy together.
Awesome.
Yeah, love that.
Thank you.
So Donald, I have an urgency story to share that I think you will respond to. I was really struck by the second video because they were talking about professional services firms, and guess what? That's what I work for. So there definitely is a culture within that. But you and I both, often have opportunities to work with the HUD headquarters leadership. And when they ask you to do something, it's quite an honor and you really want to do it. But they often don't ask you at the most convenient times. And there's a ton of urgency with it. So last year, one of the weekly office hours that HUD headquarters organizes, they said, we need you to present. And I said, okay, which week? They're like, no, in an hour. And not only did I do it, I did it really well, and I'm really good in pressure situations. So not only did I not recognize at the point that that was urgency, and I should have said, hey, wait a minute, but I did so well that I perpetuated that urgency potentially onto you or another person who was asked to do it. And when it was over, I did not feel positive about it after that. When I put it in the context of we're all working with the same entity, and if I say yes at an hour's notice, the next time I ask Donald, he better be ready in an hour's notice too. So it was a real life thing where I felt amazing until I reflected, and I thought, oh man, I shouldn't have done that.
And Chris, I can definitely empathize with you because I've been asked to do it in the same time frame several times. I think it also occurred to me that as we do our TA trainings, because we both work in that space, it's often like we're challenged by our need for perfectionism. So for instance, this particular workshop, we probably maybe have more slides than we would hope sometimes. But it's our need to give you that information back, and the need not to be seen as superstars, but to be seen as both competent, and the information, it's so urgent that we get it out, that sometimes we can be perfectionist and kind of do it in a way that is overwhelming to people. I don't think this workshop is, but I have had workshops where I have presented 100 slides. And that's not something that, people can ever follow. So this particular workshop, we do have a couple more slides that we probably are not going to get to today. It's not 100, but I think we have 2 slides that I don't think we have time for. A couple.
Right, but yeah, I'm just skipping through, Donald, as you're talking, because I'm looking at the time and I'm wondering, I thought maybe we had time for this one. What do you think?
I think we do. And I think the last one, I hope people will take a look at too. Can you go back one slide?
Yeah, let me get it.
I wish we had a little bit more time to spend on this one, but this is kind of some of the things you encounter in becoming a anti-racist organization. There's 3 zones. There's the fear zone, the learning zone, and the growth zone. And if you can, please take a look at this. These slides will be available to you, but these are 3 places that you start out in that denial phase, you start to recognize it, and then you understand the benefit and some of the resources that you can use to become a true anti-racist organization. But it starts with recognition. So just really, really good slide. As you go through this journey, I hope people will take a look at that slide in more detail later. And the last thing that we'll talk about, and we'll turn it over to Chris, is that this is Dolores Horta. She's a longtime advocate, and she'll be mad at me because we've met several times, me messing her name up, but every moment is an organizing opportunity. Every person a potential activist. Every minute a chance to change the world. And we talk about your spheres of influence. The job of becoming an anti-racist organization is both a collective job, but it's an individual job. And what you are able to do in your sphere of influence is start that change. So we hope that you do. We hope that you take some of what you've been getting in our processes here, in our training here, and you use that to help change the norms within your organization. And you recognize that they're part of a culture that we have to change. So please be your own historian, use these resources, get a little bit more information about them. We can only pack so much in 2 hours, but we hope you do your own self-discovery. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Donald. You're right. 2 hours seems to fly on us always. So next slide, please. I believe that is our last slide. There we go. One more. There we go. So thank you for joining us today. And And as I mentioned in the chat, this is our 7th session in 7 weeks. We're taking a little bit of a break here in the next couple of weeks, but we really want to, make sure you have access to all of these racial equity trainings. They're so very important and complement one another quite well. I want to thank our racial equity partners, friends, Donald and Sarah for today's session, Kristen for keeping everything going. And I want to thank all of you for joining us and attending this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information on our racial equity series sessions. Those are still ongoing. At the end of this session, when you leave, a 3-question survey will pop up. Please fill it out. We read them every week and we love to hear what you have to say. So if there's something you need more information on or something we didn't dig deep enough on or just a topic you have interest in, go ahead and let us know. We do listen to those and we do make that part of our sessions moving forward. So thank you for being with us and have a great rest of your week.